My name is Naya Jefferson, and the morning my marriage ended, I was making coffee. Not because I needed it, not because I was even particularly awake. I was making it the way I had made it every single morning for 30 years, quietly, automatically. The way your hands do things your mind has long since stopped supervising. The good coffee, the dark roast that Mark preferred, because it was our anniversary, and I had been planning that morning for weeks, and the coffee was part of the plan. Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Stories. I missed you so much. Truly, I missed you like I miss my own family. I'm starting again from zero on this new channel, and I need your full support. Please like, share, and subscribe. This means a lot to me. Stay with me till the end, because a beautiful prayer is coming in the next few days. God bless you all. Let's continue this journey together. I had a card on the counter. I had a reservation at Nikolai's Roof in Buckhead, the restaurant where Mark had ordered the wrong thing on our first real date and laughed about it so genuinely that I remember thinking, this man is going to be important to my life. I had my blue dress hanging on the back of the bedroom door. The one he told me 26 years ago in a parking lot after church made my eyes look like they had their own light source. He said that once. 26 years ago, I kept the dress. I poured the coffee into his mug first, the way I always did, and that is when I saw the note. It was folded once and placed on the kitchen counter where I usually leave his keys. My name was on the outside in his handwriting, not the careful handwriting he used for important things, but the fast, dismissive script he used for grocery lists and phone messages that didn't matter. I should have known from the handwriting. I unfolded it and I read it, and my eyes kept sliding off the words the way eyes do when they are refusing to carry something too heavy. I read it in fragments, in pieces that my brain processed one at a time because taking it all in at once was not something I was capable of at 6:30 in the morning with coffee going cold in my hand. Unhappy for years. You let yourself go. You have nothing left to offer. I am not doing this anymore. I was still reading it when I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Mark Barrett walked into my kitchen, the kitchen I had painted myself the summer Damon left for college, a warm terracotta color I had chosen from a magazine and that Mark said at the time was too bold, and he was pulling a suitcase behind him. Not a weekend bag, not an overnight case. The large suitcase. The one we purchased for the trip to Jamaica we never took because his consulting firm needed him that week, and I said it was fine, and I meant it, I genuinely meant it at the time, because that is the kind of woman I was for 30 years, the kind who meant it. He looked at me the way you look at furniture you have grown tired of, not with anger, not even with discomfort, with the flat, settled expression of a man who has already moved past a decision and is simply completing the final administrative steps of it. I left you a note, he said. I read it, I said. I do not know why I was so calm. I think my body did not yet believe what was happening. I think there is a mercy in that. A few seconds of blessed numbness before reality lands its full weight on you. I've been unhappy for a long time, Naya. This isn't working. It hasn't worked for years, and we both know it. He said this with the measured, reasonable tone of a man presenting a business case, as if he were in a conference room, as if I were a client being let go. I don't know it, I said. I don't know that at all. He set his jaw in the way he always set it when he had decided that a conversation was over and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. You're useless, Naya. I'm sorry to be direct about it, but you are. You let yourself go years ago. You never pushed yourself, never became anything, never grew. You've been standing in the same place since the day I married you, and I cannot spend the rest of my life standing there with you. He paused. Even Kezia sees it. Your own daughter. I felt that one in a place no other word had reached. Our daughter. Kezia, who I had walked through every difficult thing her life had ever handed her. Kezia, whose name I gave her from a book of names I studied for 6 weeks before she was born, because I wanted something strong, something that meant something. Kezia, who called me every Sunday morning without fail until approximately 8 months ago, when the calls became irregular, and I had told myself it was because she was busy, because life gets busy, because that is what mothers tell themselves. I did not cry. Not in front of him. I want you to understand that. I did not give him the dignity of watching me fall apart in the kitchen he was leaving. I stood at my counter with his coffee growing cold in my hand, and I watched Mark Barrett pull his suitcase through my kitchen, through the hallway where our children's school photographs still hung in matching frames, and out through the front door of our home on Westview Drive in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta, Georgia, where we had lived for 19 years. The door closed with a sound that was far too ordinary for what it was. I stood completely still. I heard his car start in the driveway, the sound of an engine I had been listening to for 3 decades, the particular rumble of it, the way it hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before settling. And I listened to it back out, and I listened to it drive away down Westview Drive, and I listened until I could not hear it anymore. Then my legs bent, and I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not in a chair, not on the step, the floor. The terracotta-colored tile I had chosen from a magazine the summer my youngest child left home, and I had finally, for the first time in years, painted something the color I actually wanted. I sat on that floor, and I cried the kind of cry that has no sound, the kind that lives so far down in your chest that it has no real path out of you. It comes in waves, that kind of crying, and between the waves, you sit in a silence so complete you can hear the refrigerator hum and the birds outside going about their ordinary morning and the distant sound of a neighbor's car, and none of it knows. None of the world outside that kitchen window knows that your life has just been handed back to you in pieces. I cried until the light through the kitchen window changed from the pale gray of early morning to the gold of a proper Atlanta sunrise. I cried until the coffee was completely cold. I cried until I had nothing left to cry with. And then I sat there, just sat there on the floor in the quiet. After a while, I cannot tell you how long, my eyes moved around the kitchen the way eyes do when you are sitting somewhere familiar and suddenly seeing it differently. The curtains I chose, the terracotta walls, the photographs on the hallway wall I could see from where I sat, the magnetic notepad on the refrigerator where I kept grocery lists, and above the notepad held up by a small magnet from Stone Mountain that Damon had brought me years ago from a school trip, was a printed sheet of paper I had nearly forgotten about. A conference registration confirmation, Healthcare Administration Community Outreach Conference, Chicago, Illinois, 3 weeks from now. I had registered for it 6 weeks ago, quietly, the way I did everything that was mine, without announcement, without explanation, paid for from the savings account I kept in my own name that Mark had never asked about, and I had never volunteered. I had spent a weekend writing the paper they had accepted for presentation. I had spent 3 evenings choosing what to wear. I had told myself that when I came home from Chicago, I would finally tell Mark about the degree, about the years of studying at this kitchen table after he went to sleep, about the woman I had been building in the margins of the life I was living. I had imagined his face. I had imagined him surprised, then moved, then proud. I sat on the kitchen floor and I looked at that confirmation paper for a long time. Then I put my hand flat on the cold tile. I pushed myself up. I stood. I poured the cold coffee down the sink. I picked up the phone and I called my sister, Dela. "I'm coming," she said, before I'd finished the first sentence. That is the thing about a sister who has known you your whole life. You do not have to explain the shape of your pain. She hears it in the spaces between your words, and she is already moving. I hung up the phone and I stood in my kitchen on Westview Drive in the West End of Atlanta, and I looked at the confirmation on the refrigerator, and I made myself one decision, the only decision I was capable of making in that moment. I was going to Chicago. Chapter 2. Dela knows everything. Dela arrived in 40 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the kitchen wall the entire time she was on her way, not because I was impatient, but because my mind needed something small and measurable to hold on to, the second hand moving, the numbers changing, something in the world still behaving the way it was supposed to behave. I had not moved much since I got up off the floor. I had washed my face at the kitchen sink. I had put the anniversary card in the drawer beneath the microwave because I could not look at it and I could not throw it away. Not yet. I had straightened the dish towel on the oven handle because my hands needed something to do, and that was the only task they could find that did not require me to think. The coffee maker was still on. The smell of it filled the kitchen the way it always did on a Saturday morning, and I hated it. I turned it off. When Dela's car pulled into the driveway, I felt something release in my chest, a tension I had not realized I was holding. The particular relief of knowing that someone who loves you is about to walk through the door, not to fix anything, just to be there. Sometimes that is the only thing that helps, and it helps more than anything else. She walked in without knocking. Dela has never knocked at my door in her life. She came in through the front, and she walked down the hallway past the school photographs, and she stopped in the kitchen doorway, and she looked at me. She did not say anything for a moment. She just looked at me the way only a sister can look at you, taking in everything at once, reading it all, filing it somewhere in the part of her that has kept every version of me since I was small. Then she said, "I'm making fresh coffee." That was how Dela handled a crisis. She made coffee. She washed dishes. She folded things. Her hands were always moving when her heart was breaking because she had learned from our mother that motion was a form of endurance. She moved around my kitchen like she owned it, which in every way that mattered she did. And I sat at the table and I watched her and I started talking, not in order. I want to be honest about that. I did not sit down and deliver a neat account of what had happened. It came out the way real things come out when you have been holding them too long. In fragments, in circles, jumping forward and then pulling backward, one memory dragging another behind it like a thread, unraveling from something that was never as tightly woven as it appeared. I told her about the note first. I got up and retrieved it from the counter where I had left it, and I handed it to her, and I watched her read it. I watched her jaw tighten. I watched her set it down on the table very deliberately, the way you set something down when what you want to do is throw it. She said nothing about the note. Not yet. "Tell me everything," she said instead. "From the beginning. Not this morning. The beginning." So I did. I told her about the nursing program. How I had been 2 semesters from completing my degree when Mark's first business collapsed, and the money disappeared, and the panic set in, and he needed me home, needed the household steady, needed someone who was not visibly frightened, even when she was terrified on the inside. I told her how I had called the program administrator and deferred my enrollment, and told myself it was temporary. How temporary had become a year, and then several years, and then a decade, and then something I had stopped counting. Dela listened. She did not say what I knew she was thinking, that she had watched this happen, that she had seen me make myself smaller and smaller to fit the shape of what Mark needed, that she had bitten her tongue for 30 years out of love for me and respect for my choices. She had never once said the words I am sure she had rehearsed. I told her about the online degree. This part was harder to say out loud than I expected. Not because I was ashamed of it. I was proud of it, deeply and privately proud in the way you are proud of things you built entirely alone. But because saying it out loud meant admitting what it represented. It meant admitting that somewhere in the last years of my marriage I had understood, on a level below conscious thought, that I needed something that was entirely mine. Something he could not touch, something that would still exist if everything else fell away. I had started the program the autumn after Damon left for college. I studied at this kitchen table after Mark went to sleep. I read on my phone during the hours I spent waiting in parking lots and doctors' offices, and all the small parentheses of time that accumulate in a woman's day when she is managing a household and a husband and a life that belongs mostly to other people. I paid the tuition from a savings account in my name only, not hidden, I told myself, simply mine, simply one thing in my life that I had not folded into the shared account where everything eventually became about his needs and his plans and his comfort. I had finished the degree. I had written the paper that the Chicago conference accepted. I had planned to tell Mark when I came home, to walk through the door with the conference program in my hand and show him what I had built in the margins of the life I was living for him. I had imagined his face. I told Dela that. I had genuinely imagined him proud. Dela put her hand over mine on the table. She said, "Naya, baby, he didn't leave this morning. He left a long time ago. This morning he just finally picked up his suitcase." I heard that. I heard it go somewhere deep. We sat in silence for a while, the two of us, in the kitchen that smelled like fresh coffee, in the house that was suddenly and completely mine in a way that felt nothing like freedom yet. Then I picked up my phone and I called Damon. He answered on the second ring the way he always did when he saw my name on the screen, immediately, without hesitation, because Damon had always treated a call from his mother as something that warranted his full attention, and I had raised him that way deliberately, and I was grateful for it now in a way I could not articulate. He heard my voice and he knew. Mothers and sons have a frequency that bypasses language, and he was on it immediately. "Mom, what happened?" Not a question, a recognition. I told him. I kept it factual because Damon needed facts before he needed emotion. He had always been that way, processing information first and feeling second, which made him methodical and dependable, and occasionally exasperating. I heard him go very quiet on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of a man containing something large. "I'm coming to Atlanta," he said. "Not yet," I said. "I need a few days first. I need to find my footing before I have people around me." He did not like that. I could hear it in the silence. But he respected it, because I raised him to respect the boundaries of people he loved, even when, especially when, those people were his mother. "Call me every day," he said. "Every single day, Mom. I don't care what time." "I will," I said. "I love you." "I know you do, baby." I hung up, and I sat with that warmth for a moment, before I made the second call. The one I had been putting to the back of my mind since the moment Mark walked out. The one I needed to make, and was dreading in a way that was different from any other dread I had felt that morning. I called Kezia. She answered after 4 rings. Her voice, when she said my name, had a texture to it, a weight, a density, that I recognized immediately as guilt. I had heard guilt in voices my entire life. I had heard it in patients when I worked in the clinic, in my children when they were young, in Mark on the rare occasions when he knew he had gone too far. I knew what Kezia's guilt sounded like, and I was hearing it now in the first second, before I had said a single word beyond her name. I told her what had happened. I was calm. I was composed in the way that you are composed when you have already spent your tears on a kitchen floor, and what is left in you is something cooler and more durable than grief. She did not sound surprised. The silence that followed was the longest silence I have ever shared with my daughter. It stretched between Atlanta and Charlotte, and it was full of something I was not ready to name. "Kezia," I said quietly, "did you know?" Another silence, smaller this time, but more devastating. "He told me a few months ago that he was thinking about it," she said. "He asked me not to say anything. He said he needed time to figure it out, and he said he didn't want you to be blindsided, but that he needed to handle it his way." I sat very still. "He told me I was useless," I said. He told me that even you agreed with him. That was the word he used, Kezia. Useless. And he put your name on it. The sound my daughter made then was not quite a word. It was the sound of something cracking. I heard it clearly through the phone from 5 hours away. Mom, I never said that. I never said anything like that, I swear to you. I believe you, I said. And I did. Mark had used our daughter as a weapon, and she had not even known she was being used. Which was its own kind of sorrow. The kind that I would have to sit with for a long time. I said goodbye to Kezia, not coldly, but briefly. I put the phone on the table. Dela, who had heard every word of both calls from 4 feet away, reached across the table and put both her hands over mine and held them the way our mother used to hold our hands when we were girls, and something in the world was too large for us. Outside the kitchen window, West End Atlanta was moving through its Saturday morning. Someone was mowing a lawn. A child somewhere was laughing. The neighborhood did not know. The neighborhood was simply being itself, the way it had been since before I was born, and something about that was both lonely and strangely comforting. I looked at the conference confirmation still pinned to the refrigerator. Dela, I said, I need you to drive me to the airport in 3 weeks. She looked at where I was looking. She read the paper on the refrigerator. She turned back to me. I'll drive you myself, she said, and I'll walk you to the security line. I nodded. We sat there together in the quiet kitchen, 2 sisters and 2 cups of coffee, while outside the world went on being ordinary, and inside this house something old was ending, and something I did not yet have a name for was, very quietly, beginning. Chapter 3. Chicago doesn't know my name yet. Dela drove me to Hartsfield-Jackson on a Tuesday morning, and she did not ask me once if I was sure. She had asked 3 times at home, 3 times over the course of the previous week, in different ways, with different levels of subtlety, and each time I had said yes, with a conviction that decreased slightly with each repetition, until by the 3rd time, I think we both understood that I was saying yes, the way you say yes, when the alternative is sitting in a terracotta-colored kitchen on Westview Drive, waiting for the grief to finish with you. She put my bag in her trunk without ceremony. She drove the way she always drove, with one hand on the wheel and the radio low, and a comfortable silence that required nothing from me. Dela had a gift for silence. She never filled it with noise just to fill it, never asked questions just to be asking. She understood that sometimes a person needs to ride through the city they have lived in their whole life and simply look at it going past the window without being required to comment on any of it. Atlanta was beautiful that morning in the way it is beautiful in that particular season. The sky, that specific shade of blue that you only get in the south when the humidity has not yet settled in for the day. The trees along the expressway thick and green, the city skyline sitting on the horizon like something that had always been there and always would be. I had lived in this city my entire life. I had been born at Grady Memorial, raised in West End, married in a church on Gordon Street that has since become something else. Atlanta was in my bones, the way a place gets into your bones when you have never really left it. I wondered, looking at it through Dela's passenger window, whether I had stayed too long, whether I had confused permanence with safety, whether there was a version of my life where I had gotten on more planes and seen more skylines and understood earlier that the world was larger than the boundaries of one man's comfort. I did not say any of this to Dela. I stored it somewhere and looked at the skyline until it disappeared behind us. At the departures level, she pulled the car to the curb and got out and lifted my bag from the trunk with the efficient tenderness of someone who has been taking care of people their whole life. She walked me to the entrance. She stopped at the point where the doors opened automatically and the air conditioning from inside reached us on the curb. She took my hand, not both hands, the way she had at the kitchen table, just one, and she held it for a moment with a pressure that communicated everything she was choosing not to say. every prayer, every worry, every piece of pride she had in me that she was too practical to perform on a curb at Hartsfield-Jackson. Then she let go. "Call me when you land," she said. "I will." And Naya. She looked at me with the direct, clear-eyed look that had been her signature since we were girls. "You belong in that room. Whatever your brain tells you on the plane, whatever it tells you standing at that podium, you belong there. You earned it at a kitchen table at midnight, and that counts. That counts as much as anything." I nodded because I did not trust my voice. I picked up my bag and I walked through the automatic doors. And I did not look back, because if I looked back at Dela standing on that curb, I was going to sit back down in her car and go home and never leave again. The flight to O'Hare was 2 hours and 17 minutes, and I spent the first 40 minutes of it staring at the clouds below us, and the remaining time reading my conference paper until the words stopped meaning anything and became just shapes on a page. I had read that paper so many times in the previous weeks that I could recite sections of it without looking, which should have been reassuring and was instead simply evidence of how afraid I was. The paper was about community health outreach in underserved Atlanta neighborhoods, specifically about the gap between available healthcare resources and the populations that needed them most. A gap created not by scarcity alone, but by geography, by transportation, by the invisible architecture of a city that had grown around certain people rather than for them. I had written it from years of observation, from knowing the West End, from watching my mother navigate a healthcare system that required more from the people who could afford least. It was good work. I knew it was good work. And I also knew that knowing something is good work, and standing at a podium in front of professionals who have spent their careers in this field and saying so out loud are two entirely different experiences, separated by a distance that confidence alone cannot always cross. Chicago received me with wind. That is the first thing. The wind coming off Lake Michigan hits you the moment you step outside O'Hare, and it is not polite about it. It is immediate and physical, and it reorganized my hair and my composure in approximately the same moment, which felt like the city's way of establishing that we were going to be honest with each other. The hotel was on Michigan Avenue, and my room was on a high floor, with a view of the lake that stopped me in the doorway when I first opened the door. I had forgotten how large Lake Michigan was. I had not been to Chicago since Damon was small, and my memory of the lake was a child's memory, impressive but abstract. Standing at that window as an adult, looking at that expanse of grey-green water meeting the sky at a horizon I could not quite find, I felt something shift slightly in my chest, something that was not grief. I stood at that window for a long time. The conference was held in the hotel's main ballroom and the surrounding meeting rooms, and the following morning I arrived early, because arriving early is what I do when I'm frightened. I orient myself, I locate the exits, I learn the room before the room fills with people. The registration desk was staffed by young women with lanyards and efficient smiles, and I collected my badge and my program, and I found the room where my session would be held, and I stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of chairs and the podium and the projection screen, and I calculated, privately, how many of those chairs were likely to be filled and whether I could maintain my composure in front of that many people. Then I went and had breakfast alone at a small table near the window, and I read my paper one more time. The session was mid-morning. I sat in the front row of my own panel, which the moderator, a kind woman from a Philadelphia hospital network, seemed to find endearing, and I listened to the presenter before me deliver a polished, confident talk on digital health infrastructure with the ease of someone who had been doing this for 20 years. My hands started shaking during his conclusion. Not visibly. I pressed them flat against my thighs, and they shook against the fabric of my slacks, and nobody could see it, but I could feel it, and the feeling of it made me more conscious of it, which made it worse, which is the particular cruelty of performance anxiety. Then my name was called. I walked to the podium. The room was fuller than I had estimated. Rows of faces, professionals, administrators, researchers, consultants, looking at me with the politely neutral expression of people who are willing to be engaged but have not yet decided whether they will be. I recognized that expression. I had seen it on Mark's face across dinner tables for years. The expression of someone who had already made a preliminary judgment and was waiting to be proven right. I looked down at my first line, I opened my mouth, and I lost it completely. The opening sentence I had rehearsed dissolved somewhere between my brain and my mouth, and what came out instead was a fragment, half a thought, trailing into nothing. I stopped. The room waited. The silence was approximately 4 seconds long, and I want to tell you that 4 seconds is nothing, that 4 seconds passes in an instant. But I want to also tell you the truth, which is that those 4 seconds were the longest consecutive seconds of my adult life, and in them I experienced, in compressed form, every doubt I had carried to that podium with me. Then I looked up. I stopped looking at my notes and I looked at the room, at these professionals in their good suits and their conference lanyards, and I thought about Gordon Street and Westview Drive and the women I knew in West End who could not access a clinic without crossing 4 lanes of traffic on a road with no sidewalk. I thought about my mother's hands. I thought about the kitchen table where I had written this paper at midnight while my husband slept upstairs in the bed I had shared with him for 3 decades. I stopped performing. I started talking. I do not remember every word I said. I remember the feeling of saying it, the sensation of the words coming from somewhere genuine rather than rehearsed, of the room's polite neutrality shifting into something more alert, more present. I saw people lean forward slightly. I saw a woman in the second row put down her phone. I saw the moderator from Philadelphia make a note on her program. And I saw the man in the 4th row. He was white, somewhere in his mid-40s, in a charcoal suit that was well made without being showy. He had the kind of face that suggested he had learned to listen carefully somewhere in his life and had never unlearned it. He was not checking his phone. He was not reviewing his own notes. He was sitting completely still with his full attention directed at the podium in the particular way that a person pays attention when they are hearing something that is landing somewhere real in them. I noticed him the way you notice stillness in a moving room. I finished my presentation. The applause was genuine, more than polite, less than overwhelming, the honest response of a room that had received something worth receiving. The moderator asked 2 questions, and I answered them without consulting my notes. A small cluster of people approached the podium afterward, and I spoke with them, and I was present and clear, and I did not shake. When the cluster thinned, I became aware that the man in the charcoal suit was waiting at a slight distance, not impatiently, not presumptuously, simply waiting with the stillness that had characterized him throughout the session. He stepped forward when the last person moved away. "Scott Edwards," he said, and offered his hand. "I run a healthcare consulting firm out of Manhattan. That was an exceptional piece of work. Not exceptional for someone who came up through a kitchen table, not exceptional given the circumstances, simply exceptional. My walls went up the way they always went up, automatically, efficiently, the reflex of a woman who had spent 30 years having her work diminished by a man she trusted." I shook his hand. I thanked him with the professional warmth that costs nothing and reveals nothing. "The methodology you used for mapping access gaps is something we have been trying to articulate internally for 2 years, he said. "You found language for it that we haven't." That was not a compliment. That was an observation. There is a difference, and I recognized it immediately, and it unsettled my walls slightly without dismantling them. "Thank you," I said again. "I appreciate you saying so." And then I picked up my portfolio from the podium, and I walked toward the door, because my legs needed to move, and my heart was beating faster than the situation rationally warranted, and I needed to be somewhere that was not standing in front of a man who was looking at me like I was worth looking at. In the elevator going up to my floor, I stood with my portfolio against my chest, and I looked at my own reflection in the polished elevator doors. My hands had stopped shaking. I noticed that. I held that. My hands had stopped shaking. Chapter 4. Cursed. I almost did not go to the rooftop event. I want to be transparent about that because it matters to what happened next. The decision to go was not made from confidence or social enthusiasm or any of the things that make evening events feel appealing after a long day. It was made from something much smaller and much less heroic. It was made because I was sitting on the edge of my hotel bed at 6:15 in the evening, looking at the event details in my conference program, and I heard Dela's voice in my head saying, clear as if she were in the room, "You did not get on that plane to sit in a hotel room, Naya Jefferson." So I got up. I changed into the good blazer I had packed, the deep burgundy one that I had bought for myself 2 years ago from a boutique on Peachtree Street, and that Mark had looked at once and said nothing about, which I had learned over the years to interpret as mild disapproval expressed through silence. I put on earrings. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not with vanity, but with the particular assessment of a woman who is preparing to walk into a room full of strangers and needs to know that what is looking back at her is someone she can stand behind. I looked fine, more than fine. I told myself that with more conviction than I felt, and I went down to the elevator. The rooftop was on the 14th floor, and it was everything a Chicago evening in that season could be. The city spread out in every direction, catching the last of the day's light, the lake dark and glittering to the east, the buildings lit from within so that the skyline looked less like architecture and more like something alive. There were perhaps 60 or 70 people gathered in clusters across the terrace, glasses of wine in hand, the collective sound of professional conversation rising and mixing with the wind off the lake. I got a glass of sparkling water from the bar. I wanted to stay clear, wanted my wits entirely my own that evening, and I found a position near the railing where I could see the lake and also see the room, and I gave myself permission to simply observe for a few minutes before engaging with anyone. This is a strategy I have used my entire life in situations that require me to be more socially confident than I actually feel. You find a spot, you watch, you identify the people who seem genuine rather than performative. Then you move toward them. I had been there perhaps 10 minutes when the woman from the Philadelphia Hospital Network, the moderator from my session, whose name I had learned was Dr. Renata Morris, found me at the railing and we began talking. She was warm and direct, and she asked intelligent questions about my research methodology, and I found myself relaxing into the conversation in the way you relax when you realize that someone is actually interested and not merely being professionally courteous. We were perhaps 15 minutes into our conversation when I became aware of the man. He was not subtle. That was his particular kind of confidence. Not the confidence that refines itself into elegance, but the confidence that has never been required to refine itself at all, because it has always had enough money and enough social position to move through the world without friction. He was tall, well-dressed, in the expensive but graceless way of a man who has people to advise him on these things, and he had been getting progressively louder with his wine for the better part of the last half hour, in the way that certain men get louder when they want to ensure that every conversation within range understands they are the most significant person present. His name, I would later learn, was Richard Caldwell. He developed commercial real estate. He had built several things in several cities that had generated significant press coverage and significantly less lasting value. He was the kind of man who entered a room and began immediately calculating his position within it. He drifted into the orbit of our conversation the way such men drift, not by being invited, but by simply arriving and assuming the invitation was implied. Dr. Morris was asking me about returning to professional life, and I was answering her honestly. I said that I had spent many years out of formal professional settings and that returning had required a reconstruction of confidence that was ongoing and imperfect and nothing like the clean narrative that people sometimes expected. Richard Caldwell heard that. He turned from the adjacent conversation he had been half conducting, and he looked at me with the particular look that I recognized immediately, and that I believe most women of a certain age and a certain life experience recognize immediately. The look of a man who has just identified what he believes to be a vulnerability and is deciding whether to press on it. "Starting over," he said, with a smile that was the shape of a smile without any of the content. "At this stage, that takes a certain kind of optimism, I'll give you that." Dr. Morris went slightly still beside me. The people nearest to us conducted a collective, almost imperceptible adjustment, the subtle reorientation of a group that has registered that something uncomfortable is happening and is deciding whether to intervene or become very interested in their drinks. I looked at Richard Caldwell. I kept my expression entirely composed. "It takes exactly the kind of optimism," I said, "that comes from knowing your own work." He smiled wider. He was not deterred. Men like Richard Caldwell are not deterred by the first response because they have learned, from years of being the loudest person in rooms full of people, too polite or too cautious to confront them, that the first response is rarely the last word. "Sure, sure," he said, with the tone of someone humoring a child. "But there's a reality to these things, isn't there? The field moves fast. Networks take years to build. And at a certain point," he paused, letting the pause do work, "some women just aren't built for this world without a particular kind of support structure holding them up." Another pause, another smile. "Might be you're just cursed." He said it lightly, almost conversationally, as if it were an observation rather than an assault. The word landed in me the way a cold thing lands, with a shock that radiates outward from the point of impact. Not because I believed it. I want to be precise about that. I did not believe it. Not even in the most frightened corner of myself, not even fresh from a kitchen floor in Atlanta, but because I had heard a version of it that morning from a man who had known me for 30 years, and hearing it again now from a stranger in a city far from home, in a room full of professionals who were watching, felt like the world was conducting an experiment to determine exactly how much a woman could absorb before she stopped standing upright. I was about to respond. I had the words fully formed. I had them arranged and ready, and I want you to know they were good words, precise and unsparing, and delivered in the quiet register that cuts deeper than volume ever does. I was one breath away from saying them. And then Scott Edwards stepped into my peripheral vision. He moved without urgency, without theater. He positioned himself beside me, not in front of me, not between me and Richard Caldwell in the protective stance of a man inserting himself into a woman's confrontation, but beside me, in the way of someone who has simply chosen a location, and that location happens to be here. He looked at Richard Caldwell with an expression of such complete and unhurried calm that it was, in itself, a form of authority. "Richard," he said. The single word carried everything necessary and nothing superfluous. Richard Caldwell's smile recalibrated. The shift was small, but I caught it. The micro-adjustment of a man who has just registered that the person now standing beside this woman is someone whose opinion of him has professional consequences. "Scott," Richard said, slightly less expansive than before. "I heard your pitch this afternoon," Scott said pleasantly. "Third time I've heard that particular pitch, actually. Different city each time, still watching for the results to materialize." He said it with a smile that was warm and genuine and contained within its warmth the absolute precision of a surgical instrument. "Good to see you." Richard Caldwell excused himself. The people nearby returned to their conversations. Dr. Morris exhaled quietly beside me. Scott turned to me and his expression was simply present, not triumphant, not awaiting gratitude, simply present, the way a person is present when they have done a thing because it was the right thing to do and require nothing in return for it. I was about to handle that myself, I said. I know, he said. I could see that. Then why? Because he's been doing that to people in rooms like this for 15 years, and someone with actual standing in this field needed to say something that would cost him something. He paused. That's all. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time without the automatic defensive assessment that I had deployed when he approached me after my session, without measuring him against the template of disappointment that 30 years had pressed into me. He looked back without performance, without the slightly elevated self-consciousness of a man who knows he has just done something that could be received as impressive and is waiting to see if it lands that way. That man has never built one thing that outlasted its own press release, Scott said. I'd genuinely consider the source. I was considering it, I said. I had considered it thoroughly. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the beginning of one. I don't doubt it, he said. Dr. Morris, who had been a gracious and discreet witness to this entire exchange, quietly touched my arm, said she hoped we would stay in touch, and moved away with the practiced elegance of a woman who understood when two people needed a conversation and was kind enough to provide the space for it. Scott and I stood at the railing with Chicago spread out below us and the lake dark beyond the city's light, and we talked for perhaps 40 minutes about the conference, about the field, about Atlanta and Manhattan, and the different textures of those two cities, and what each of them demanded from the people who lived in them. He was interesting. That is the plainest way I can say it, and also the most accurate. He was genuinely, substantively interesting in the way that people are interesting when they have paid attention to the world they have moved through rather than simply moving through it. I was careful. I maintained a professional warmth that I was proud of, present enough to be courteous, bounded enough to be safe. When the event began to thin, I said goodnight, and I meant it as a conclusion. He said goodnight and did not push, did not suggest an extension of the evening, did not find a reason to delay my departure. He simply said goodnight with the same uncomplicated directness that had characterized everything he had said since he stepped into my peripheral vision. I rode the elevator back to my floor alone. I stood at the window looking at the lake. Something I had not invited and did not know what to do with had lodged itself quietly in my chest and was sitting there with no intention of leaving simply because I had not authorized it. I did not name it. I went to bed. Chapter 5. What Mark Gets. I flew home from Chicago on a Thursday morning, and Atlanta received me the way it always received me, with heat and humidity and the particular smell of the city in that season that I had never been able to describe to anyone who had not grown up here, but that I recognized in my body before my mind caught up with it. Dela was waiting at arrivals. She did not ask me how it went. She looked at my face when I came through the doors, and she read whatever was written there. And something was written there. I could feel it. Something that had not been on my face when she left me at the security line 3 days ago. And she nodded once, the small, decisive nod of a woman who has received the information she needed and filed it appropriately. Patricia Hammond, she said as we walked to her car. She's the best divorce attorney in Buckhead. I made you an appointment for Monday. I stopped walking. Dela. Naya. She looked at me with the patient, immovable expression she had been deploying on me since we were children. He left. He said what he said. You have a degree, a career beginning, and 30 years of legal entitlement that he has apparently forgotten about. Monday, 10 o'clock. I started walking again. Monday, I said. Patricia Hammond's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Road, with a view of Buckhead that suggested her hourly rate was substantial and her results justified it. She was a black woman, somewhere in her 60s, with close-cropped silver hair, and the energy of someone who had heard every version of this story and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them, not coldly, not dismissively, but with the particular calm of a professional who has made peace with the full range of human behavior and simply gets on with the work. She listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. She asked questions that were precise and without sentiment, the kind of questions that cut through the emotional architecture of a situation and go directly to its legal skeleton. What was in my name? What was jointly held? What I had contributed financially and practically over the course of the marriage? What documentation existed? I answered everything. I had brought a folder, organized the night before at Dela's kitchen table, because preparation is how I manage fear. And I laid it open on her desk, and I watched Patricia Hammond's expression as she reviewed its contents. She looked up after several minutes. "Mrs. Jefferson," she said, "your husband has significantly underestimated your position." I felt something move in my chest that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but lived in the narrow territory between them. Because here is what Mark had apparently not considered in the calm, administrative certainty with which he had packed his large suitcase and walked out of our kitchen. 30 years of marriage in the state of Georgia is not a small legal matter. The years I spent managing our household while his businesses failed and recovered and failed again, those years had weight. The times my name appeared on documents he had needed me to sign, those signatures had consequences. The financial contributions I had made during the lean years from money I had earned through part-time work that Mark had accepted without comment, those contributions were documented. Patricia Hammond's associate made 2 phone calls that first week to Mark's attorney with preliminary findings. I was not present for those calls. I did not need to be. I received a text from Patricia on a Wednesday afternoon that said simply, "His attorney has requested a revised discussion. We'll talk Friday." I read that text, standing in the kitchen on Westview Drive, where I'd gone to collect more of my belongings. I had been putting it off, coming back to the house alone. Dela had offered to come with me, and I had said no because I needed to do it without an audience, needed to be able to move through those rooms and feel whatever I was going to feel without managing anyone else's reaction to my feeling it. I started upstairs. The bedroom first. I moved efficiently, the way you move when efficiency is the only alternative to sitting down on the floor again. I took my clothes, my books, the small wooden jewelry box my mother had given me that had sat on the dresser for 19 years. I took the photograph from the nightstand, not a photograph of Mark and me, but one of Damon and Kezia as children, taken in the backyard of this house on a summer afternoon when they were small and loud, and entirely unaware that their happiness was something I was quietly memorizing for later use. I took that photograph and I put it carefully in my bag. I went through Damon's old room. It smelled faintly of him still, or I imagined it did, the way mothers imagine the specific smell of their children long after those children have grown and left. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I did not go in. Some rooms you can stand in the doorway of, and that is sufficient. I went downstairs. The kitchen. I stood in the kitchen for longer than I stood anywhere else. I stood in it, and I looked at the terracotta walls and the curtains I had chosen, and the small imperfections in the paint near the window where I had been less careful with the roller and never gotten around to touching up. I looked at the space on the refrigerator where the conference confirmation had been. I had taken it down and packed it before I flew to Chicago, a small act of intention that I had not analyzed at the time, but that felt significant now. 30 years of mornings in this kitchen, 30 years of coffee and school lunches and homework spread across this table, and dinners made and dishes washed and conversations had and not had. This kitchen had been the center of a life, a real life, an actual life full of real love, even if the love was not always returned in kind. I grieved it, Standing there alone in the quiet of a weekday afternoon, I let myself grieve it completely and without apology, because the grief was real and the years were real, and pretending otherwise would have been a dishonesty I was no longer willing to practice. Then I picked up my bag. I walked out. I drove through Midtown on my way back to Dela's. Not the most direct route, but the route I took anyway. The way you sometimes take the route that will cost you something because some part of you has decided that the cost is necessary. I knew which building. Dela had mentioned it with the careful neutrality she used when delivering information she knew would hurt. I drove down the street slowly. His car was in the parking lot. The lights were on in a window on the third floor. The building was modern and clean, and entirely anonymous, and it told me nothing about the life being lived inside it, except that it was a life I was not part of. I sat at the traffic light, and I looked at that lit window. I felt many things simultaneously in the way that human beings feel things when the situation is large enough to contain contradictions. I felt the residue of love, not love for who Mark was now, but love for who he had been at 25, in a church parking lot, telling me my eyes had their own light source. Love for the man who had existed before. Whatever series of quiet decisions had turned him into the man who packed a suitcase on an anniversary morning. I felt anger that was clean and clarifying. I felt something that was almost, not quite, but almost, pity. For a man who had thrown away 30 years for an apartment in Midtown that had no curtains I could see from the street. The light changed. I drove to Dela's. 3 weeks later, Damon called me on a Sunday evening. He had heard from Mark. Mark had called wanting to arrange a visit to Houston, wanting to see his grandchildren, wanting, as Damon described it with the measured restraint of a man being very careful with his words, to begin rebuilding some kind of connection. "What did you say?" I asked. Damon was quiet for a moment. I said, "Dad, I love you." And I said, "Not right now." 4 words. Quiet, definitive, delivered without drama or extended explanation. The particular sentence of a son who has watched his mother sit on a kitchen floor and has drawn his own conclusions about what that requires of him. I asked Damon not to close the door permanently, not because Mark deserved an open door. That was not the point. The point was that Damon deserved a father, imperfect and accountable, if Mark was willing to become that. The relationship between a father and a son belonged to the two of them, and I was not willing to let my pain dictate its terms. "He's still your father," I said. "Whatever he did to me is between him and me. What he is to you is yours to decide." Damon said, "How did you get to be this way?" "What way?" "This fair, after everything." I thought about it honestly. "I don't know that it's fairness," I said. "I think it's just that I'm too tired for anything smaller than the truth. And the truth is that hatred is heavy, and I have enough to carry." After I hung up, I sat in Dela's guest room, my room now for the foreseeable future, and I thought about Mark sitting alone in that Midtown apartment with the lights on in the third-floor window. I thought about what it cost him. Not materially. Patricia Hammond was ensuring that the material cost was appropriate and documented. But personally, the cost of losing Damon's immediate presence, the cost of Kezia's guilt and its complications, the cost of having told a woman she was useless and having that woman go to Chicago and stand at a podium and be received as something entirely other than useless. I did not celebrate it. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in imagining Mark's private accounting of what he had lost. Satisfaction would have required me to make his pain the point, and his pain was not the point. The point was mine. The point was a woman in Dela's guest room on a Tuesday evening opening her laptop and reviewing the notes from a consulting conversation that Scott Edwards' firm had been in touch about, a formal invitation sent through the conference organizers for a professional discussion about community health methodology. I read the invitation 3 times, then I opened a new document and I began to prepare. Chapter 6. New York sees me different. The invitation from Scott's firm came through the conference organizers on a Tuesday afternoon, and I read it twice before I believed it was real. Not because it was implausible. I understood intellectually that my paper had been received well, that the conversation on the Chicago rooftop had established a professional connection, that these things sometimes led to formal consultations. I understood all of that in the organized, rational part of my mind that had been running my life's practical operations for decades. The part of me that had been sitting on a kitchen floor not very long ago did not find it quite so straightforward. I called Dela. "New York," I said. "New York," she repeated, in the tone of someone confirming a flight destination. "They want me to come to Manhattan for a consulting discussion. Scott Edwards's firm. It came through the conference organizers. It's entirely legitimate. It has nothing to do with—" I stopped. "With the man who stood next to you at the rooftop event," Dela said, with the precision of a woman who had been paying close attention to every word I had said about Chicago and filing it in an organized and retrievable location in her mind. "It's professional," I said. "Entirely professional." "Of course it is," Dela said, in a tone that communicated that she had additional thoughts on the subject that she was choosing, with great discipline not to voice. I almost declined the invitation anyway. I sat with it for 2 days, the invitation open in a tab on my laptop that I returned to periodically, reading it again, as if one more reading would resolve the ambivalence I was carrying. The ambivalence was not about the professional opportunity. The opportunity was clear and real and exactly the kind of thing that the degree and the paper and the conference had been building toward. The ambivalence was about something more complicated, about walking into a room in Manhattan where Scott Edwards would be present and doing so with the full knowledge of what had happened on that rooftop and what had lodged itself in my chest afterward that I had still not fully dislodged. On the 3rd morning, I thought about the kitchen floor. I accepted the invitation. I had never been to New York as an adult. I had passed through JFK once, years ago, on a connection to somewhere else, but I had never actually been in the city, never stood in it, never moved through it, never had it come at me at its full, unmediated volume. I did not know what to expect, and I prepared inadequately for what I got. JFK received me with controlled chaos, the particular organized pandemonium of one of the world's largest airports operating at full capacity on a Wednesday morning. I navigated it with my bag and my conference folder and the focused expression of a woman who has decided that uncertainty is not the same as unpreparedness. The taxi to Manhattan crossed the bridge and then the city simply appeared. There is no gradual introduction to New York. There is no gentle acclimation. One moment you are not in it, and the next moment you entirely are. The scale of it, the verticality, the density of human activity packed into every visible block, the noise that is not a single noise but 1,000 simultaneous sounds that the city has somehow organized into something that functions. I sat in the taxi and I looked out the window and I felt very briefly, very honestly, like a woman from West End Atlanta who had no business being here. Then I remembered the podium in Chicago, the 4 seconds of silence. What happened after? I sat up straighter and I watched Manhattan come toward me through the windshield. The firm's offices were in Midtown, on a high floor of a building on Lexington Avenue with glass walls and a reception desk, staffed by a young man who directed me to a conference room with a view of the city that I had to make a conscious effort not to stare at. I was early. I am always early when I am nervous. And I sat alone in that conference room for 8 minutes, looking at Manhattan spread out below and breathing with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided that composure is a choice. Scott's team arrived before Scott did. 4 people, 2 women and 2 men, all of them sharp and prepared, the kind of professionals who had clearly read my paper carefully enough to ask questions that went beyond its surface. We spent 20 minutes in preliminary conversation before Scott came in, and those 20 minutes were enough to establish that this was not a courtesy meeting. These people were genuinely interested in the methodology. They had specific questions about the gap mapping framework and how it could be applied at scale across multiple cities simultaneously. I was answering a question about transportation corridor analysis when Scott walked in. He came in without disruption, quietly, taking a seat at the side of the table rather than the head, which I noticed and which told me something about how he ran his room. He did not interrupt the conversation. He listened for several minutes before he said anything, and when he spoke, it was to add a layer of context to what I had already said, rather than to redirect it. He was professionally impeccable throughout the morning. He did not acknowledge the rooftop event. He did not look at me with any expression that fell outside the range of collegial respect. He disagreed with one element of my recommended approach, directly in front of the room, with specific and well-reasoned objections. And when I countered his objection, he listened to my counter with genuine attention, and then said, "You're right. That's a stronger framework," without any of the performance that men sometimes attach to changing their position. I had not seen that in a very long time. A man changing his position without making it a transaction. We broke for lunch, sandwiches brought in, the working lunch of a firm that did not waste its billable hours on restaurant reservations. And the conversation continued, and I was present and sharp, and I heard myself speaking with an authority that did not feel performed. It felt inhabited. It felt like something that had been waiting in me through 30 years of other obligations, and had finally, in this conference room on Lexington Avenue with Manhattan visible through the glass, found a room large enough to stand up in properly. In the afternoon session, a woman named Diane, who led the firm's Southeast regional work, asked me about the specific demographic data I had used for the West End analysis. I walked her through it in detail, and at some point during that explanation, I became aware that the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is being said that matters. Not dramatic quiet. The quiet of people listening carefully because what they are hearing is useful. Scott was watching me from his seat at the side of the table, not in the way I had steeled myself against, not with anything personal or presumptuous in it, with the expression of someone watching a thing work the way it was designed to work, a kind of quiet, undemonstrative satisfaction that was somehow more affecting than admiration would have been. I looked away from him and kept talking. The meetings concluded at 4:30. The team began gathering their materials, and the room loosened into the informal conversation that follows a productive day. I was talking with Diane about a potential follow-up when I became aware that the room had emptied around us gradually, and that when Diane excused herself to take a call, I was alone in the conference room with Scott Edwards and the Manhattan skyline, and the specific quality of late afternoon light that makes that city look, for a few minutes each day, like something painted rather than built. He was standing near the window. He turned when Diane left. "That was an exceptional afternoon," he said. "Diane doesn't say someone is right unless they are. She told you that you were right 4 times today." "I counted 3, I said. "The 4th one was the look she gave me when you explained the corridor framework. That counts." I smiled despite myself. I felt it happen, and I did not entirely disapprove of it. He crossed the room to where I was standing, not close, not with any advance in it, simply moving to a position where he did not have to speak across a conference table. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "Not as a continuation of this." He gestured at the room, the papers, the laptops, the remnants of the working day. "As 2 people, if you're willing." I looked at him. The answer that came to me immediately was yes, and the answer I gave him was no. I gave it gently, but I gave it without hesitation, because hesitation would have been its own kind of dishonesty, a performance of uncertainty I did not actually feel. I knew what I was saying no to, and I said it clearly, and he received it clearly, and he did not flinch, did not recalibrate into wounded dignity, did not make the moment about himself in the way that a refusal can sometimes become about the person being refused. "Understood," he said simply. "Thank you for today. The firm will be in touch about next steps." I collected my things. I said goodnight. I walked to the elevator, and I rode it down to the lobby, and I walked out onto Lexington Avenue, where the city was moving at its full evening velocity around me. I found my hotel 3 blocks north, and I went up to my room, and I stood at the window. Manhattan at night is a different city from Manhattan in the day. At night, it becomes something that cannot quite be explained to someone who has not stood at a window looking at it. The density of light, the sense of a million simultaneous lives happening within your field of vision, the feeling of being in the center of something vast and indifferent and magnificent. I stood at that window, and I felt the word yes still sitting in me where I had not said it. My phone rang. Kezia. I almost did not answer. Then I did. She was crying before she spoke. Not the dramatic crying of a crisis, but the quiet, effortful crying of someone who has been holding something back for a long time and has reached the point of structural failure. Her husband had said something to her that evening. Not a catastrophic thing, not a single devastating event, but the kind of small, casual cruelty that a person in an unhappy relationship learns to dress as humor. A comment about her intelligence, delivered with a smile at dinner in front of friends. The kind of thing you cannot respond to without being accused of taking it too seriously. The kind of thing I recognized with the complete recognition of someone who had been on the receiving end of that particular category of diminishment for years. She did not call her friends. She called me. We talked for 2 hours. I sat on the hotel bed in Manhattan, and my daughter sat in her house in Charlotte, and we talked in the real way. Not the careful way, not the managed way, not the way we had been talking for the months before Mark left, when something had been wrong between us that neither of us was naming. We talked the way a mother and daughter talk when the pretense has been stripped away, and what is left is just the truth of 2 women who love each other trying to find their way back to each other across the distance that had grown between them. I did not give her advice about her marriage. I knew better than that. I listened. I reflected back what I heard without interpretation or prescription. I told her once, carefully, that what her husband had said was not acceptable, regardless of the smile it was delivered with, and then I left that statement in the room between us and did not return to it. At the end she said, "Mom, I'm sorry. About everything. About what Dad said, and about... I should have called you. All those months, I should have called." "You're calling now," I said. We said goodnight. I sat in the dark for a moment with the phone in my hand and the city lit up outside my window. Then I opened my laptop. I worked until midnight. Not because I had to, because the work was good and the city outside the window was alive, and I was a woman in New York at a desk, doing work that mattered, and I wanted to inhabit that fact completely, for as long as the night would allow it. Before I closed the laptop, I opened my email. I sat for a long time looking at the compose window. Then I closed it without writing anything. Tomorrow, I told myself. There was time. There was, for the first time in a very long time, time. Chapter 7. Houston puts me back together. Damon had been asking me to come to Houston since the morning I called him from Dela's kitchen. He had asked carefully, the way he asked for things he wanted badly. Not with pressure, not with the kind of repeated requesting that becomes its own form of insistence, but with a steady, patient availability that communicated that the invitation was permanent and the welcome was unconditional, and the only variable was my timing. Every time we spoke, he said, at the end of the call, "The room is ready whenever you are, Mom." Just that. No elaboration, no guilt attached to it. Damon had always known how to love people without crowding them. I had watched him do it his whole life, and I had recognized it as something he had learned by watching me do it for his father. And that recognition carried a complicated tenderness that I did not always know what to do with. I flew to Houston on a Friday morning 6 weeks after Chicago. He was waiting at the arrivals level when I came through the doors, standing with his hands in his pockets and his face doing the thing it had always done when he saw me, the thing that started when he was a small boy and had never entirely stopped, this involuntary brightening that he was not fully aware of, and that I had been quietly storing in the part of me that keeps the things too precious to examine too often. He hugged me the way men hug their mothers when they have been frightened for them, and the fear has been sitting in them for weeks, and the hug is the first opportunity to put it somewhere outside themselves, long and without any hurry to end it. "You look good," he said, when he stepped back and looked at me. "I look tired," I said. "You look good and tired," he said. "That's different from just tired." Renee was at the house when we arrived. Damon's wife, a tall woman from Beaumont, with a generous laugh and the practical warmth of someone who had grown up in a large family and understood instinctively that the way you made a person feel at home was not by making a production of welcoming them, but simply by behaving as though they had always been there. She hugged me and said dinner was almost ready, and handed me a glass of sweet tea and pointed me toward the back porch where the children were, and that was the entire welcome, and it was exactly right. Their children, a girl and a boy, both of them at ages that require constant motion and generate constant noise, descended on me the moment I appeared on the porch with the uninhibited physical enthusiasm of small people who have not yet learned that adults sometimes need to be approached gradually. I was hugged around the knees. I was pulled by the hand. I was presented immediately with a drawing that I was expected to admire, and did admire genuinely, because it was the kind of drawing that a child makes when they are drawing with their whole self, and the result is alive in the way that only completely unself-conscious things are alive. I sat on the porch steps in the Houston evening, and I let them climb on me, and I breathed. Houston in that season was warm and flat and wide, in the way that Texas cities are wide, built without the vertical ambitions of New York or even Atlanta, spreading outward instead of upward, the sky enormous above it in a way that felt, after the density of Manhattan, like an exhale. Damon's neighborhood was quiet residential streets and mature trees and the sound of lawn sprinklers in the evening and children on bicycles and all the textures of an ordinary American life being lived at a comfortable and unhurried pace. I needed ordinary. I had not understood how much I needed ordinary until I was sitting on those porch steps with a child's weight against my side and the smell of Renee's cooking coming through the screen door and the sky going slowly pink above the Houston rooftops. The week had a rhythm that settled over me by the second day, like something I had forgotten I was allowed to have. Mornings were the children's mornings. Breakfast chaos, school preparations, the particular beautiful disorder of a household that contains small people with strong opinions about their own sock choices. After the school run, Damon and I would sit on the porch with coffee and talk, or not talk, in the easy alternation of people who have known each other long enough that silence requires no justification. He did not bring up his father until the third day. When he did, it was straightforward and without dramatics. He told me that Mark had called again, that the conversation had been brief, that Damon had told him he needed more time before he was ready for a visit. He told me this as information, not as a request for my response to it. "How do you feel about him?" I asked. Honestly. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet when he was constructing an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "Angry," he said. "Sad, confused, because he was a good father in a lot of ways when we were small, and I can hold both of those things, but it's not comfortable holding them both." "No," I said, "it isn't." "How do you hold it?" I thought about that. about Mark in the church parking lot, and Mark with the suitcase, and all the years between those two images that contained both the love and its erosion. "One at a time," I said. "I don't try to hold them both at once. I pick one up, look at it, put it down, then pick up the other one." Damon nodded slowly. "That's a good system." "I invented it 3 weeks ago," I said. "Don't know yet if it works long term." He laughed. It was the first time I had made my son genuinely laugh since before Mark left, and the sound of it did something restorative in me that I could feel physically. Renee was generous with me in the way of a woman who understands that her mother-in-law is going through something that requires space rather than advice. She included me in the household without making me a project. She asked my opinion on things, small things, domestic things, and received my answers as though they mattered. And the cumulative effect of being asked and listened to in small ways over the course of several days was more healing than any single significant conversation could have been. I pushed the children on the backyard swing until my arms were tired. I read the same picture book 4 consecutive times one evening without complaint, because the youngest wanted it 4 times, and 4 times was what it took. I helped with a school project that involved significant quantities of glue and construction paper, and a creative interpretation of what a solar system looks like that I chose not to correct. I slept 8 hours every night. I had not slept 8 consecutive hours since before Mark left. I had not realized how much of my sleep I had been spending on a vigilance I could not name, until the vigilance was no longer necessary, and my body in Damon's guest room in Houston, with the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, simply released. On the 5th evening, I was sitting alone at Damon's kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Damon and Renee had gone to watch something in the other room, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. I had my laptop open. I had been reviewing some notes from the New York meetings, adding to them, thinking through the follow-up questions that Diane had mentioned wanting to discuss. I opened my email. I sat with the compose window open for a while. Then I wrote to Scott Edwards. I gave it a professional subject line. I wrote 2 paragraphs about a methodology question that had genuinely occurred to me. A real question, a substantive one, not a pretext. And then at the end, almost as though a different hand had written it, almost as an afterthought that had been waiting the entire email to be said, I also wanted to say thank you for Chicago, for what you did on the rooftop. You didn't have to step in, and I want you to know it meant something to me. Not because I needed the intervention, but because of the way you did it. I looked at that last paragraph for a long time. I pressed send before I could revise it into something smaller. I closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table in the Houston quiet and listened to the ceiling fan in the next room and the distant sound of the television and the ordinary sounds of a house at rest. My phone lit up on the table beside me. 12 minutes. He had replied in 12 minutes. I looked at the notification for a moment without opening it. Then I picked up the phone. His reply was 3 sentences. The first sentence addressed the methodology question directly and usefully, a genuine response, thoughtful and specific. The second sentence said, "You were already handling Richard Caldwell. I just wanted a front row seat." The third sentence said, "New York has better restaurants than one evening could cover. The invitation stands whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready." No pressure attached to either half of that sentence. I read it 3 times. I set the phone face down on the table and sat in the kitchen for a while longer. There was a feeling in my chest that I did not have a current name for, something that had the texture of warmth and the temperature of caution, and underneath both of those things, deeper than both of them, something that felt tentatively, carefully, like the first evidence of spring in a place that has had a very long winter. I did not name it. I was not ready to name it, but I sat with it at Damon's kitchen table in Houston on a Thursday evening, and I did not push it away, and that, for now, felt like enough. The following morning, Damon found me on the porch with my coffee before the children were up, and he sat down beside me, and we watched the Houston morning come in over the rooftops, and after a while he said, "Ma, you look different." "Different how?" I asked. He thought about it with the careful consideration he gave to things he wanted to say accurately. "Like yourself," he said finally. "Like you look in the photographs from before I was born." I did not know what to say to that, so I looked at the rooftops for a while, and I held my coffee with both hands, and I let the morning be what it was. It was enough. For right now, it was more than enough. Chapter 8. What I owe my daughter. I drove to Charlotte alone. I did not tell Dela I was going because Dela would have had thoughts about it, and her thoughts would have been reasonable and well-intentioned, and I would have absorbed them, and they would have complicated something that I needed to approach with my own mind, uncrowded by anyone else's perspective. I texted her from the road, already on I-85, headed northeast, the Atlanta skyline shrinking in my rear-view mirror, and her reply came back in 3 words: "Call me after." That was Dela. 3 words that contained an entire conversation she was choosing to save for later. The drive from Atlanta to Charlotte on I-85 is the kind of drive that thinks for you. The highway is long, and the landscape is the particular green of the Carolina Piedmont in that season, and there is enough monotony in the miles to allow your mind to move without obstruction through the things it has been circling. I had been circling this drive for weeks. I had been composing and decomposing versions of the conversation I was about to have since the night in Manhattan, when Kezia called me crying, and something cracked open between us that had been sealed for too long. I had not told Kezia I was coming either. I called her from a rest stop outside Gaffney, South Carolina, when I was less than an hour out. She answered on the second ring, and I said, "I'm on my way to you. I'll be there in less than an hour. Is that all right?" There was a silence that was not a surprised silence. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting for something and had just heard it arriving. "Yes," she said, "I'll be here." Kezia's house was in a neighborhood in South Charlotte, a well-kept brick house on a quiet street with a Japanese maple in the front yard that was turning at the edges with the season. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment, not from hesitation exactly, more from the need to be still for one more minute before the conversation that I had been rehearsing and abandoning and rehearsing again began in earnest. She opened the front door before I got out of the car. She was standing in the doorway when I walked up the path, and she looked like me. She has always looked like me, which Mark used to say with such pride, and looking at her face in the doorway of her own house, I saw my own eyes looking back at me from my daughter's face, and I felt the complicated fullness of that in a way that I could not have anticipated. We did not hug at the door. We stood for a moment in the doorway, and then she stepped back and I came inside. Her kitchen table. It is always a kitchen table. I have noticed this about the conversations that matter most in my life. They happen at kitchen tables, not in living rooms, not in restaurants, not in the careful neutral spaces that people sometimes choose for difficult conversations. Kitchen tables, where the light is practical and there is always something warm to hold in your hands, and the setting makes no pretense of the conversation being anything other than what it is. She made coffee. I watched her move around her kitchen, and I saw in her movements the efficiency of them, the way she kept herself occupied while something difficult was being approached, something that looked uncomfortably like me at a younger age, the way I had always kept my hands busy when my heart was full. We sat down. We looked at each other across the table. I did not begin with the accusations. I did not begin with the night Mark left, or the words he said, or his name on the suitcase, or any of the things I could have begun with. I began instead with a question that I had been carrying since Charlotte first became a place I needed to go. "Tell me what he told you," I said. "All of it. His version." She looked surprised. She had come to this table, I think, expecting to defend herself, expecting that the structure of the conversation would be my grievance, followed by her explanation, followed by the negotiation of some kind of reconciliation. She had not expected to be asked first, to simply tell me what she knew. She told me. Mark had called her, not once but several times over the course of many months, building his case the way a person builds a case when they want a verdict before the trial begins. He had told her that the marriage had been empty for years, that I had withdrawn from him emotionally, had stopped being a partner, had become a presence in the house rather than a person in his life. He had told her that he felt invisible, that he felt irrelevant, that he had tried to reach me and I had not been reachable. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what I was doing?" I said. "During the years he was telling you I had withdrawn from him." She shook her head. I told her about the degree, about the midnight hours at the kitchen table, about the savings account and the conference and the paper and the podium in Chicago. I told her all of it, not as a rebuttal, not as evidence for a counter-argument, but because she was my daughter and she had been given half a story and she deserved the other half. I watched her face as I talked. I watched the specific thing that happened in it, not a sudden dramatic reversal, not a movie moment of revelation, but something more real than that. A fracture. A slow, structural fracture in the certainty she had come to this table with, the certainty that had been built from her father's voice over many months of telephone calls. "He didn't tell me any of that," she said, when I finished. "No," I said, "he didn't know most of it." She absorbed that. He said the word. "I know what word he used," I said. "He said it to my face." She looked down at her coffee cup. "He used my name when he said it to you." "Yes. Mom." Her voice when she said it was the voice of a girl, not a grown woman, the voice that existed underneath the adult competence, the voice that still lived in her from the years when I was the person who fixed things. "I never said that. I never said anything like that about you. Ever." "I know you didn't," I said. "I believed you when you told me that on the phone, and I believe you now." "Then why?" She stopped. She was trying not to cry, and I recognized the effort because I had made it myself so many times, the physical work of containing something too large for the space you are trying to keep it in. "Because your father was frightened," I said, "and frightened people sometimes use the names of the people they love as armor. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make what he did forgivable, but it makes it human. And I would rather understand it than just be angry about it." She cried then, not dramatically, quietly, with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes down, in the way of a woman who has been raised not to make her emotions an imposition on other people. I recognized that too. I recognized where she had learned it. "I should have called you," she said. "When he first started talking to me about leaving, I should have called you immediately." "Yes," I said. "You should have." I did not soften it. She needed the truth more than she needed comfort, and I respected her enough to give it to her. "I convinced myself that it wasn't my place," she said, "that it was between you and him, that getting involved would make it worse." "And that was partly true," I said, "and partly it was easier to believe his version because believing my version would have required you to do something hard. I understand that, Kezia. I'm not telling you I don't understand it." She looked up at me. "Are you angry with me?" I thought about that honestly, the way she deserved to have it thought about. "I was," I said. "For a while I was very angry, but anger at you felt like a luxury I couldn't afford when I was already carrying so much else, and then somewhere between Atlanta and Houston and New York, I put it down." I paused. "Not for you, for me, because I needed my hands free." We sat in silence for a while. Not a hostile silence, a working silence, the kind that two people sit in when something large has been moved and they are both recovering from the effort of moving it. Then Kezia said something I was not prepared for. She said, "My marriage is not good, Mom." Not a crisis announced, not a dramatic disclosure, just a sentence, delivered with the exhausted directness of someone who has been not saying something for a long time and has finally run out of the energy required to keep not saying it. I set my coffee down. I did not speak immediately. I gave the sentence the space it deserved. "Tell me," I said. And she did. Not everything. She was not ready for everything, and I was not asking for everything. She told me enough. She told me about the comment at dinner that she had called me about in Manhattan, and she told me that it was not the first comment of that kind, and that she had spent considerable energy convincing herself that she was too sensitive, that he was joking, that the accumulation of small things did not add up to a pattern. She told me this with the careful, qualified language of a woman who is beginning to hear herself say something out loud and is simultaneously listening to herself say it and understanding for the first time, in the hearing of it, what it means. I listened. I did not tell her what to do. I will never tell my daughter what to do with her marriage. I know too well what it costs a woman to receive that kind of advice from her mother. The complicated resentment of it, the way it can close a door rather than open one. I listened and I reflected, and once, carefully, I said, "You don't have to decide anything today, but you do deserve to be spoken to with respect in your own home. That is not a high standard. That is a flaw." I left that on the table between us, and I did not return to it. We talked for 3 hours in that kitchen. Not always about the hard things, about the children, about her work, about Houston and Damon, and the school project involving the solar system and the generous quantities of construction paper. We talked the way we had talked before something came between us, before a man who was frightened of losing something had decided to use our relationship as a place to store his fear. At the end, she stood in the doorway the way she had stood when I arrived, and she said, "Mom, I'm sorry." 2 words that had required the entire 3 hours to arrive at their most honest form. "I know you are," I said. I walked to my car. I backed out of the driveway. I drove to the end of her street and turned onto the road that would take me back to I-85 and back to Atlanta. Somewhere past the South Carolina border, the road opened up and the night was clear and enormous above the highway, and I reached over and turned the radio up, not a particular song, whatever was playing. I turned it up until it filled the car completely, and I drove with the windows down and the Carolina night coming in, and I did not think about anything specific for a long time. I just drove. I drove the way a woman drives when she has done something difficult and done it honestly, and the other side of it, while not easy, is at least visible. The way you drive when you have put something down that you have been carrying for a long time and your hands are tired from holding it and empty from releasing it, and slowly, tentatively, beginning to understand what they might be ready to hold instead. I called Dela from the Georgia state line. "Well," she said. "It was hard," I said. "And?" "And it was necessary," I said. "And I think it's going to be all right. Not immediately, but eventually." Dela was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. Just that. The single word of a woman who had been waiting for it and received it and needed to say nothing further. I drove home through the Georgia night with the radio up and the windows down, and Atlanta waiting for me at the end of the road, like something that had always been mine and that I was only now, truly, returning to. Chapter 9. The Question. Scott and I had been talking for 6 weeks before he came to Atlanta. Not in the way that people talk when they are being careful with each other, circling, testing, managing the distance between what they mean and what they say. We had moved past that somewhere around the 3rd or 4th call, somewhere in the transition from professionally framed conversation to the kind that starts with a question about work and ends 2 hours later with neither person entirely sure how they got from there to here. He called on Tuesday evenings mostly. I do not know when that became the pattern. It established itself the way patterns do between people who are finding a rhythm without discussing the finding of it. Tuesday evenings I would be in the kitchen at Dela's, or later in my own apartment, a small place I had found in the West End, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with good light, entirely mine, and my phone would ring and I would answer it and we would talk. He was funny in a way I had not anticipated, not performatively funny, not the kind of funny that announces itself and waits for the laugh. The dry, observational kind that catches you off guard in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely. The kind that makes you laugh before you have registered that you were going to. I had not laughed that way, spontaneously without preparation, in a very long time, and the sensation of it was both pleasurable and slightly alarming, the way any sensation is alarming when you have been without it long enough to have stopped expecting it. He told me about growing up in a small town in Ohio, Findlay, a place I had never been and could not have located on a map without assistance. In a household that was comfortable in the practical sense, without being wealthy in any significant way. His father had worked for an oil pipeline company, and his mother had taught elementary school, and between the two of them, they had raised 3 children, with the emphasis on usefulness rather than ambition, which Scott described with a fond specificity that told me the values had taken, even if the vocabulary of his adult life had shifted considerably. He had built his firm from a single consulting contract with a hospital in Cleveland that he had won at an age when winning it should not have been possible. He told this not as a success narrative, not with the particular energy of a man recounting his own origin story for effect, but incidentally, as context for something else he was explaining, and the incidental quality of it told me more than the story itself. I told him about West End, about my mother and Grady Memorial and the nursing program I had left. I told him about the kitchen table degree in more detail than I had told anyone except Dela. The specific texture of those midnight hours, the particular satisfaction of understanding something difficult and writing it down in your own language. He listened in the way that he listened to everything, with full attention and without the reflexive need to respond immediately, allowing a silence after I finished that was not empty, but full of the thing that had just been said. "You built that entirely alone," he said, after one of those silences. Not a question, an acknowledgement. "Yes," I said, "while running a household and a family in someone else's life." "Yes." Another silence. "That's not a small thing, Naya." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and he let me say nothing, and that was its own kind of conversation. When he told me he was coming to Atlanta, a hospital network consultation in Midtown, entirely legitimate, the kind of business travel that his calendar apparently generated with regularity, he mentioned it as information rather than invitation. He said it at the end of a Tuesday call, almost as a postscript. "I'll be in Atlanta next week, Midtown, 2 days." "I know Atlanta reasonably well," I said, which was the most neutral possible response to the most neutral possible delivery, and we both understood exactly what was being navigated. "I'd like to see you," he said, "if you're willing. Dinner, not business. I said that in New York, and you said no, and I respected that, and I'm saying it again now, because I think enough time has passed that it's worth saying again, but only if you want to." I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," I said. The word came out before I had fully decided to say it, which I took as information. He arrived in Atlanta on a Wednesday. We made the arrangement for Thursday evening, and I spent more time than I intended to spend thinking about where to suggest. I wanted somewhere I knew. I had said as much to myself, had acknowledged without embarrassment the desire for the home advantage, the comfort of familiar geography in an unfamiliar situation. I settled on a restaurant in Inman Park that I had been to several times with Dela, A small place with good food and good light, and the kind of room that allowed for genuine conversation without the performance of a special occasion. He arrived before me. I had intended to arrive first, home advantage, recall, and he had arrived before me anyway, which I discovered when I walked in, and the host said my name and led me to the table where Scott Edwards was already seated, already standing when he saw me coming, with the particular unhurried courtesy of a man for whom standing when someone arrives is not a calculation, but a habit. "You're early," I said, sitting down. "I'm always early," he said. "I've learned to bring something to read." "What were you reading?" He told me, and it was not what I expected, and I said so, and he smiled the way he smiled when something genuinely amused him. Not the social smile, the real one, the one that reached his eyes with a slight delay, as though it had traveled some distance to get there. We ordered. We talked. The evening moved the way evenings move, when the conversation is genuine, without effort, without the awkward joints of topics being changed and new ones being found. We talked about his Atlanta meetings and about a paper I was developing as a follow-up to the Chicago presentation, and about Inman Park and how the neighborhood had changed over the years, and about Findlay, Ohio in winter, which Scott described with the resigned affection of someone who has spent enough winters in warm cities to understand what he escaped. He got something wrong halfway through the evening. We were talking about Kezia. I had told him in broad terms about the drive to Charlotte, about the conversation at the kitchen table, and he said, with the good intention of someone reaching for reassurance, "Maybe it just needs time, and then it'll settle into something easier." The words were kind. They were also the words of someone standing comfortably outside the situation, describing its probable resolution with a confidence that the situation did not warrant. I went quiet. Not dramatically, just a small withdrawal, a fractional cooling that I could not entirely prevent. He caught it immediately. I watched him catch it, watched his expression change from the ease of a man who has just said something he believes to be helpful to the alertness of a man who has registered that what he said landed differently than he intended. He stopped. "That was inadequate," he said. "I'm sorry. I was reaching for something comforting, and I reached past the truth of what you actually experienced." I looked at him across the table. "You don't know what that felt like," I said. "From inside it, between a mother and a daughter with 30 years of history and one man's fear in the middle of it." "No," he said, "I don't." He held my gaze steadily. "Tell me, if you want to. I'd rather understand it than have said the wrong thing and moved past it." So I told him. I told him about driving to Charlotte without telling anyone, about sitting in the driveway in front of the Japanese maple, about the kitchen table and the coffee neither of us drank, and the 3 hours of excavating something that had been buried under someone else's version of events. I told him about what Kezia had disclosed about her own marriage, and about choosing not to give advice, and about driving home on I-85 with the windows down and the radio up. He listened to all of it without a single interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That was one of the bravest things I've heard someone describe doing." "It didn't feel brave," I said. "It felt necessary." "Most brave things do," he said. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, the restaurant Inman Park was doing what Atlanta neighborhoods do on a Thursday evening, alive with the particular relaxed energy of a city that knows how to be comfortable in itself. People on the sidewalks, the smell of the restaurants, the trees along the street lit from below in a way that made them look deliberately beautiful. The check came. "We split it," he suggested. I agreed. And there was something in the ease of that small negotiation that felt like its own kind of information. On the sidewalk outside, we stood in the warm Atlanta evening, and the moment acquired the quality that moments acquire when both people know that something is about to be said and are standing in the last seconds before it is said. He turned to me. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Directly, without any architecture around it, because I think you are someone who deserves directness more than you deserve careful language." I waited. "I want to know you," he said. "Not as a professional contact, not as an interesting person I met at a conference. I want to know who you are and how you think, and what you're building, and what frightens you, and what makes you laugh without preparation. I have wanted that since Chicago, and I have been patient because patience was what the situation required, and I would continue to be patient for as long as necessary, because what I feel is not a temporary thing that will resolve itself with time." He paused. "That is what I wanted to say. The rest is yours to do with as you choose." I stood on the sidewalk in Inman Park, and I looked at this man who had stood beside me on a Chicago rooftop and listened to me at a conference table in Manhattan and made me laugh on Tuesday evenings and gotten something wrong at dinner and apologized for it without ego and asked me to tell him the truth and then listened to the truth when I told it, and I told him mine. I gave 30 years to a man who packed a suitcase on our anniversary morning and told me I was worthless, I said. I sat on a kitchen floor. I got on a plane. I stood at a podium with shaking hands. I drove to my daughter in the middle of the night and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours, and I am still in the middle of becoming something, and I do not know yet the full shape of what it is. I stopped. I don't know if what I feel is real or if it is relief. Relief that someone is looking at me like I am worth looking at. I don't know if I can trust my own judgment about men. I gave my best judgment to one man for 30 years, and he told me it was worthless. I held his gaze. "I'm 54 years old," I said. "I am starting over from the foundation. Most mornings, I am still learning who I am without someone else's name attached to mine, and that is the truth of where I am." He did not argue with any of it. He did not tell me I was wrong to feel what I felt, or that I should trust myself, or that everything was going to be fine. He did not reach for the comfortable thing. He said, "Then take whatever time you need. All of it. Every day of it. I am not going anywhere, Naya. That is not a performance. It is just the truth." I walked to my car. I drove back to my apartment in the West End. My apartment, my kitchen, my curtains that I had chosen, my walls that I had not yet painted but would paint whatever color I chose. And I sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the street I had grown up on. I sat there for a long time. Then I picked up the journal I had started keeping, something I had not done since I was in my 20s, this practice of writing the truth down in a place that belonged only to me. And I opened it to a clean page. I wrote one line. "What if I am worth the risk?" I closed the journal. I sat in my chair in my apartment in West End, Atlanta, with the street outside going quietly about its evening business, and I held that question the way you hold something fragile, with both hands, carefully, giving it the full weight of your attention. I did not answer it that night, but I held it, and holding it felt, for the first time in longer than I could measure, like something that belonged entirely to me. Chapter 10. My name is Naya Jefferson. The community center on Cascade Road had been standing in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta since before I was born. I knew this building the way you know the buildings that frame your childhood, not with the conscious knowledge of someone who has studied them, but with the body knowledge of someone who has walked past them 10,000 times in every season, every mood, every iteration of themselves, from small girl to grown woman. My mother brought me here for summer programs when I was young. I had walked past it on the way to the bus stop for years. I had driven past it on the way to everywhere else for decades. I had never stood at its microphone before tonight. The woman who organized the event, a community health advocate named Gloria, someone I had met through the professional network that had been growing steadily around my work since Chicago, had called me 3 weeks earlier and asked if I would speak, not about healthcare methodology, not about gap mapping frameworks or demographic analysis or any of the technical language that had become the vocabulary of my professional life, She wanted me to speak to the women in this room about the other thing, about the personal thing, about what it looks like when a woman decides, in the middle of her life, that the middle is not the end. I had said yes immediately, and spent the following 3 weeks wondering why I had said yes immediately. I had written notes. I had discarded the notes. I had written different notes and discarded those too. I had stood in my kitchen in the West End apartment the morning of the event, practicing sentences out loud and listening to how they sounded, and abandoning most of them because they sounded like sentences that had been prepared to sound a certain way, rather than sentences that were simply true. In the end, I went without notes. I put on the burgundy blazer, the one I had worn to the Chicago rooftop, the one Mark had looked at once and said nothing about, and I drove the 2 miles to Cascade Road, and I parked, and I sat in my car for 4 minutes, and then I got out. The room was full. I had not anticipated the fullness of it. Gloria had told me to expect a good turnout, and I had translated that into a modest but engaged crowd, and what I walked into instead was a room packed with women, seated in every chair, standing along the back wall, clustered near the door. Women of every age, though the majority of them were in the middle years of their lives and beyond, the years that the world tends to treat as a kind of slow diminishment rather than what they actually are, which is the years when a woman finally knows enough to be dangerous. They were from this neighborhood and neighborhoods like it. They were women who worked double shifts and kept secrets and held families together with their bare hands and organized church fundraisers and raised other people's children alongside their own and showed up for everyone who needed them and asked themselves for very little. I knew them. I was them. I sat in the front row while Gloria made introductions, and I looked at my hands in my lap. Steady, both of them, which I noted with a private gratitude. And I thought about the podium in Chicago, and the 4 seconds of silence, and what had happened when I stopped performing and started talking. I thought about a kitchen floor in Atlanta. I stood up when my name was called. The microphone was slightly too low, and I adjusted it. And that small practical action, the simple adjustment of a microphone stand in a community center on Cascade Road, settled something in me. The ordinariness of it, the reminder that this was a room and a microphone and women who had come out on an evening to hear something true, and that what was required of me was not performance but honesty, and honesty was something I had been practicing in increasingly demanding circumstances for the better part of a year. I looked at the room. "My name is Naya Jefferson," I said. "I grew up 2 miles from this building. My mother walked past this community center on her way to double shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital for 20 years. I have driven past it 10,000 times in my life, and I have never stood at this microphone before tonight." I paused. "I want to tell you why." I told them about the kitchen floor. I described it exactly, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor for something larger, but as a floor, the specific terracotta color of the tile, the sound the coffee maker makes when it finishes its cycle, the way the morning light comes through a kitchen window at 6:30 in Atlanta in that season, the particular quality of it, the gold of it, coming through curtains I had chosen for a kitchen. I had painted the color I wanted because my husband was gone, and I could finally do it without commentary. I told them about sitting on that floor and crying the kind of cry that has no sound. I heard the room shift when I said that, not a sound exactly, a collective internal movement, the almost imperceptible adjustment of many people simultaneously recognizing something they have experienced and never heard, named out loud in a room full of other people. "Some of you know that floor," I said. "Not my floor specifically. Your floor, your kitchen, your bathroom, your car, in a parking lot somewhere, wherever the place was when something ended and your legs stopped working temporarily and you went down. You know what I'm talking about, and I know, you know, and I want you to know that I know it too. I am not speaking to you from a place above that floor. I am speaking to you from having been on it." The room was completely still. I told them about Chicago, about Dela's hand at the security line, about the plane taking off and Atlanta getting small, and the specific terror of arriving at a podium in a city that did not know my name to present work I had built at a kitchen table at midnight while my husband slept. I told them about the 4 seconds of silence after I lost my opening line and what happened in those 4 seconds. The full compressed weight of every doubt that had accompanied me to that podium, and what happened in the 5th second when I looked up from my notes and stopped performing and started talking. "There was a moment," I said, "when I understood that the thing standing between me and my own voice was not my lack of ability. It was not my age. It was not the 30 years I had spent outside of a professional room. It was the belief, absorbed so gradually over so long, that I had stopped noticing I was carrying it, that my voice was not worth the space it would take up." I let that sit. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to answer it honestly inside yourself, not out loud, just inside, where only you can hear it. Whose voice told you that, when you decided not to apply for something, when you talked yourself out of the class or the trip or the conversation you deserved to have, when you made yourself smaller so someone else could feel larger? Whose voice was it, and when did you decide to let it stay?" The silence in that room was the most inhabited silence I have ever stood inside of. I told them about Kezia, not in detail. Some things belong to the people they happen between, but enough. I told them that betrayal does not always come from strangers, that some of the most painful reckonings of my life had happened across kitchen tables with people I loved, that I had learned in the past months that the question was not whether those reckonings were painful. They were, profoundly. They cost me things I will not pretend were inexpensive, but whether I was willing to have them anyway, whether I valued the truth of my relationships more than I valued the comfort of their surface. "Healing," I said, "is not a single morning. I need you to hear me on this because I am tired of the version of this story that ends with a single morning when everything became clear and the woman stood up transformed and went on to her beautiful new life. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me was a series of mornings, most of them ordinary, some of them hard, a few of them genuinely terrible, in which I made the decision one more time to get up and do the next necessary thing." I stopped. I looked at the room. At these women on a Tuesday evening in the West End of Atlanta, who had come to a community center on Cascade Road and filled every seat and lined the back wall. "My mother used to say," I told them, "that a woman who knows her own worth is a woman the world does not know how to price." I did not understand what that meant when she said it to me. I was too young and too in love and too certain that my worth was something that someone else would see and confirm for me. I paused. "I understand it now." I breathed. "I am not going to tell you it gets easy," I said. "It does not get easy. It gets true. You get truer. You get clearer about what you will accept and what you will not, about what is yours and what was only ever borrowed, about the difference between a life that is being lived and a life that is being managed for everyone else's comfort." My voice did not shake. I was grateful for that privately, in the part of me that was still monitoring the situation while the rest of me simply spoke. "My name is Naya Jefferson," I said. "I sat on a kitchen floor not very long ago. I got on a plane. I stood at a podium with shaking hands and I found my voice in the 5th second after I lost it. I drove to my daughter and sat at her table for 3 hours and told the truth in both directions. I learned that a broken thing and a finished thing are not the same thing, that the end of one life is not the end of a life." I looked at the room one last time. "You are not finished," I said. "Whatever floor you have been sitting on, whatever voice has been telling you that the best of it is behind you, whatever morning you woke up and did not recognize your own reflection, you are not finished. You are in the middle of something, and the middle is not the end. I paused for the last time, and I am just getting started. The room came to its feet, not all at once. It was not a choreographed thing, not a single unified surge. It moved through the room the way real responses move, person by person, starting somewhere in the middle and spreading outward until the entire room was standing, and the sound of it was something I felt in my chest rather than simply heard. I stood at the microphone and I let it come. I am not ashamed to tell you that I cried. Not the soundless, flawed crying of a woman alone in a kitchen on the worst morning of her life. Differently. The crying of a woman standing upright in front of other women who are also standing, which is a different thing entirely, a lighter thing, a thing that does not require the floor. I did not see Scott until I stepped away from the microphone. He was in the back of the room, near the door in the particular position of someone who arrived after the room was full and found the nearest available space and has been standing there. For how long I did not know, could not know. He was standing among women who did not know his name, and he was not performing anything. He was not arranging his expression for my benefit or constructing a posture that communicated how he felt. He was simply there. His face, when I found it in the room, was the face of a man who had heard something that had moved him and was not trying to manage the evidence of that. His eyes were bright in the way that eyes get bright when a person has been trying not to cry and has mostly succeeded. I had not told him about this event. Dela had. I would have thoughts about that later. I would sit Dela down and deliver those thoughts with precision, and she would listen with the expression of someone who does not regret what they did, but is willing to hear about it anyway. And by thoughts I mean gratitude, delivered emphatically, the way you deliver gratitude to a sister who has known you your whole life and occasionally knows you better than you know yourself. People surrounded me after the microphone, women who wanted to talk, who had things to say, who pressed my hand and said my name and told me their versions of the kitchen floor story, their versions of the plane they almost did not board, and I received every one of them because every one of them deserved to be received, because that is what you do when someone trusts you with the true shape of their experience. It was perhaps 40 minutes before I came through the community center doors into the parking lot on Cascade Road. The Atlanta night was warm, and the streetlights were on, and the neighborhood was doing what it always did in the evening, alive in the quiet, unhurried way of a place that has been here a long time and intends to remain. The same streets I had walked as a girl, the same neighborhood I had returned to after 30 years of being someone's wife. The same city that had received me back without ceremony and without condition, the way home receives you when you finally understand that you never really left. Scott was standing near my car, not blocking it, just near it. Waiting with the patience that I had come to understand was not a performance of patience, but an actual quality of the man, something that had been cultivated somewhere in a small town in Ohio, and had survived intact through everything that wealth and success and the particular pressures of his professional world had subjected it to. I walked to him. We stood in the parking lot under the West End streetlights, and for a moment neither of us said anything, which was its own kind of conversation between two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to read them. "I wasn't going to tell you about this," I said. "I know," he said. "Dela called me. I'm going to speak to Dela about that. She told me you would say that." The corner of his mouth. "She also told me to come anyway." I looked at him. This man who had stood beside me on a Chicago rooftop and listened to me in a Manhattan conference room and made me laugh on Tuesday evenings and gotten something wrong at dinner in Inman Park and apologized for it without ego, and told me, on a sidewalk, that he was not going anywhere. "I'm still scared," I said. "Good," he said, without hesitation, without performance. "That means it's real. The things that don't scare you a little aren't worth enough." I don't know how to do this, I said. I am 54 years old, and the last time I began something with someone I was 23, and I did not know then what I know now, and I'm not sure that knowing it makes it easier. It doesn't, he said. I don't know how to do it either. I think that might be the point. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I took his hand. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony that the moment might have accommodated. I simply reached out and took his hand the way you take the hand of someone you have decided to trust, with the careful, clear-eyed trust of a woman who has learned the difference between surrender and choice, and is choosing. He held it the way you hold something you understand the value of. We stood in the parking lot on Cascade Road in the West End of Atlanta, and we did not go anywhere immediately. Behind us, the community center windows were still warm with light. Inside, I could hear voices, women still talking, still in the room, not ready to leave the thing that had been built in there tonight, wanting to stay inside it a little longer. I understood that completely. Some things you want to stay inside of. The night was ordinary and enormous around us, the streetlights and the warm air and the sound of the neighborhood going quietly about its evening, and the distant sound of Atlanta being itself, this city that had held me my whole life and that I was only now, fully and without reservation, returning to. I held Scott Edwards' hand in a parking lot in the West End, and I was not performing happiness, and I was not pretending certainty, and I was not constructing a version of this moment that was more resolved than it actually was. I was simply there, present, upright, clear-eyed, mine. There would be more kitchen tables, more difficult conversations, more mornings that required the decision, one more time, to do the next necessary thing. I knew that. I held that knowledge without fear, because I had learned in the past months that I was capable of kitchen tables and difficult conversations and mornings that required decisions. I had learned that the woman who sat on the floor was the same woman who stood at the microphone, and that getting from one to the other was not a transformation, but a remembering of who you were before you forgot. I had not forgotten anymore. I looked up at the Atlanta night sky, at the stars visible between the city's light, at the enormous ordinary sky above West End, above Cascade Road, above the community center where my mother had brought me as a girl, above the streets I had walked 10,000 times in every version of myself. I took one breath, and then I smiled, not for anyone, just because. My name is Naya Jefferson. I sat on a kitchen floor. I got on a plane. I stood at a podium with shaking hands and found my voice in the 5th second. I drove through the Carolina night with the windows down. I learned that a broken thing and a finished thing are not the same. I took a hand in a parking lot in West End and I chose. And I am just getting started.